Peace to the family. Welcome to another episode or show, We Charge Colonialism podcast and book club. We are We Charge Colonialism, grassroots think tank, and I am Ikemba Ajore, one of the researchers and writers of We Charge Colonialism.
Peace, everyone. This is Frank. Good morning. Host for the Revolutionary Repatriation Education Lecture Series.
Peace, everyone. Good morning. This is Natasha, member of WCC, educator, community organizer. So welcome.
All right, welcome, and peace to the chat. Peace to everybody that's viewing, tuning in. As usual, I want to implore you to like and share the podcast, and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already subscribed. Be a part of our community. And peace to Brother Sayero, who was on the front line yesterday. Said he was training, as I am in training at this moment, and will attend this class should time permit. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm reading the wrong message. Uhuru comrades, I'm being self-critical because I did not notify you in advance that I missed yesterday's class with Comrade Educator Frank because I was in a protest against the FBI. Uhuru, and I'm assuming that's in connection with the FBI raids of the Uhuru houses. So the African People's Socialist Party last year had four of its headquarters or offices, I should say, raided by the FBI. So, there's a campaign or a movement, hands off Uhuru. If you're not familiar, definitely look into that. Chairman Omali Yeshitela and the whole Uhuru movement is going to need the people's support to make sure what happened in the 60s doesn't happen in the 2020s, because we are on the move. So just try to give them as much support as possible, and we'll keep you updated on what's happening around that issue. So with that being said, as usual, we get into our weekly roundup, and then in the second half, we're going to discuss Consciencism by Nkrumah. We're actually finishing up Consciencism today, so this will be our last day covering that book. Excited, we're about to go into Dr. Bobby E. Wright's work of menticide. So looking forward to having those discussions around that book. So we're going to get into our week. We know how this hour goes real fast, so we're going to get into it with our weekly roundup. I have a short story, so I'll just get mine out the way. I was looking at Ghana, and there was a report on Ghana's cocoa production. It said Ghana cocoa arrivals up 76% by December the 15th. And the Ghana Cocoa Board, or Cocoa Bot, which was created back in 1947. Just looking at that history really quick too, like Cocoa Bot, or the Ghana Cocoa Board, was created after the African workers protested against fixed prices that were being fixed by European merchants. So this is going back to what colonialism is, and how colonialism creates economic conditions where the workers get exploited, and the merchants and the bourgeois class are able to benefit at the expense of all the work that the workers are doing. So the cocoa workers, they decided to strike against these merchants, and decided not to produce any cocoa for 8 months. And so this caused the merchants to have to make concessions. And so the Cocoa Board was created. It wasn't the Ghana Cocoa Board at that time, but there was a Cocoa Board that was created to make competitive, help protect the workers of Ghana. The interesting thing, though, is that Nkrumah, who invested in this Cocoa Board, he was ousted, of course. I think what was it, 1960, Frank, or was it a little later? You recall? But Ghana, Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, he was there was a coup d'état, and he was pushed out of Ghana, out of the leadership role, and so
It was in a the 50s.
No, I think it was 1960, but someone could put it in the chat. Sorry about that. For some reason, it eludes me right now. I think it was at least 1960, but
I think it happened before independence. I think that was the time he went to jail and he left the UGCC, the United Gold Coast Convention.
No, I'm talking about the coup. The coup
d'etat. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. But the point of the matter, though, that just to make a long story a short one, though, the cocoa board that has been in place for decades has not been able to protect the African working class, and part of that has to do with Nkrumah, who had another vision for Ghana and the working class being ousted. So there has been this corruption, but the cocoa board is still in place. And but what's happening in light of it all, just to tie everything in, cocoa production is rising. Ghana is planning to increase the salaries. 1966, I was way off. I said 66. Thank you, appreciate that. 1966. So they're planning to increase the wages of the workers 30% this year. And I'm bringing all of this up because this is on the surface. This is positive. We know that Ghana a year and a half ago decided to refine cocoa in Ghana. They went to the European, Switzerland in particular, said we're no longer selling unrefined cocoa to you guys just for you to sell it back to us, because this is what colonialism does, right? They take these raw materials from the place of its production, manufacture it, and sell it back to the people at a higher price, where it would be a lot cheaper if the people were to do it themselves. But now, in light of all of this, I'm just like watching what's happening internationally as it relates to Ghana. Ghana, who's recently been in economic woes due to mismanagement, debt, and so forth. Now they're taking $3 billion from the IMF. $3 billion from the IMF. If we're familiar with the 1980s, when the IMF and World Bank was going crazy with all of these structural readjustment loans, where they were able to dictate the countries such as Ghana and other African countries, their policies, and all through Latin America as well, their policies based off of these resources that they are giving to these quote unquote developing nations, or underdeveloped nations, as Walter Rodney would say. And so it's sort of a repeat. $3 billion. What do Ghana have to give up? The other part of this, I'll leave it here, is under capitalism, corruption is rewarded. Corruption is rewarded. Mismanagement is rewarded. Because Ghana, at the end of the day, the bourgeois class, all of this money that Ghana owes, where is this money going? Is what I want to know. It's like, where are the resources going? So the bourgeois class is able to exploit and oppress African, and I'm talking about Africans in Ghana, are able to exploit and oppress the Ghanaian people. And then when there is this situation where they're in an economic bind, and they're dealing with these economic woes, they need a bailout, and so they go to the colonizer for resources. But the same people who caused the economic crisis in the first place are being awarded to continue to mismanage. But again, they're in alignment with the colonizers anyway. They're working together. At the end of the day, it's the African working class that suffers. So I kind of tied two things together, but I'm keeping an eye on the cocoa production that's taking place and what's happening with them in Ghana and the economic conditions. But I wanted to see if y'all had any initial thoughts.
Go ahead, Frank.
Okay. Yeah. Let me just, you see, Africa. Sometimes, like when you discussing one thing and then another thing just come from the other side, and, it just infused into the whole discussion. So the issue with Ghana, you see, that is why show like this is very important, and we are urging African leaders to try their best as possible to be able to watch show like this on YouTube on their spare time they have, because it will help them in their leadership, and we help them in what to do in terms of how they can govern Africa very well. You see, Nana Akufo Addo or Dankwa Addo, you know, when they get, and mostly the African leaders, when they get into power, newly, the first thing they focus on is running to the West, running to IMF, running to the Barclays Bank for an assistance. And this is what exactly happened in the 60s when African nations were getting independent, which I thought we talked about it yesterday. The first thing that came to their mind was, okay, we have gained independent, or we are getting independent. We don't have the finance, we don't have the support to carry on development. And that is why we have to be very careful when we're talking about development process in Africa. We are not talking about building buildings. We are not talking about building things that look like Europe or that look like America or that look like China. Okay? We have to know what kind of development we want and how we want to go about carrying it so that it won't be a constraint on us in the future. And that was a mistake that was made back then in the 60s, where African leaders went back to their colonial master for an assistance, and the colonial master found that necessary in where they put them in a condition where how they call it, Nkrumah called neo-colonialism, which of course he saw coming out. And this is what exactly happening again with this whole IMF loan and foreign loan and things. Now, Nana Akufo-Addo, when he got into power, he felt that the only way Ghana was going to progress or move on was to go to the West and take huge loan, okay, and put that into the economy. Now you can go and take loan. You can do some major development and want to make the country look beautiful as compared to Europe and America. But as long as the human capacity the human capacity of the people, your citizens, are not developed, okay, are not well equipped to put them in a situation where they can manage the nation, okay? Because when you talk about GDP, that you're talking about the country. You can't go bring money from outside and bring it into the country and you think the country have money. The country does not have money. It's like you go and credit money and put it in the bank and you say you have money. You don't have money. You have to put that money into business for that money to be able to generate income so that you can pay the people money back. And that is what happened to the more African nations. They go and take this money and then come back and that money don't generate, right? Now, in the moment you began to hold back things from the colonial master, and then it became a constraint on you. All along, Ghana have been owing IMF. IMF never came out with a report to say this is the amount Ghana owing, right? But the moment Ghana started, Nana Akufo-Addo started talking some things, and then started talking about holding cocoa back, start talking about holding some resources into the country back, right? That's the time IMF came out. They came out with a report to say, look, Ghana, you owe it about $49 billion. So stop running your mouth. Start talking, okay? If not, this is what we're going to do because you can't pay this money back. And that is what happened to the most African nations. And once that happened, if you can really remember, when that report came out, Nana Akufo-Addo actually slowed down, on some things that he was actually drastically taking into the country. And this is what, some of our forefathers said, if we don't take care of our independent properly, the colonizer will come back again as investor. And this is what exactly happening, okay? So the moment you want to take your resources and make it state-owned or to make it benefit the people or the working class, then they come against you like, look, okay, then pay back our money that we owe you. And you don't have it to pay back. So these are the things that is happening, and that's why we're urging the African nations or leaders to actually watch platforms like that and stop watching CNN because it's not benefiting you. Stop watching BBC. It's not benefiting you because it's all Western narrative that they're going to bring out. And you cannot take Western narrative and try to put it into your system. It's not going to benefit your system. That's the mistake they keep making. But again, thank you for bringing the story out. But again, it's our African leaders who are actually making things difficult on the African continent.
And to points, Frank, one of the point that you raised in terms of the development process about African people deciding for themselves, what does development look like to them? that it doesn't necessarily mean, or it shouldn't necessarily look like building Ghana up or other African countries up to look like European countries, to work like European countries. So I think that's part of the reason why when we think about independence and when we think about this idea of development and moving forward, we see when we're thinking about Africa and other places around the world as well, where we have, African people, we're not thinking about building or developing in a way that is led by our vision of what we want. We're mostly tied to this idea of industrialization, technology in the way that, Europeans have developed it and have and see it for the future. And so I think that's a key thing to think about when we're thinking about the ways, like Kimber was saying, watching this whole thing with the IMF and the amount of money, and also the cocoa increasing the cocoa production, but also increasing the wages for the workers. Okay, what do we want these workers to be doing? What do we want them to be able to live like, to exercise in terms of their abilities and their responsibilities per se. So that's one of the things that I'm thinking about in terms of, the point that you brought up, and also this story, but also thinking about this whole idea of debt. When we think about colonialism and globalization, and how debt really is used as a way to enslave people. And we know we already have like debt crises within the United States, with people, with the country itself. And so, this is one thing that it makes me curious about, just not in terms of like not knowing it, but like digging a little bit deeper, because we know that this whole idea of living your life in debt is something that's created through colonialism. Because when we think about pre-colonialism, you didn't have every country depending on European countries or other countries in order for them to be able to live and maintain and sustain themselves. Obviously, you had people trading and doing things that are beneficial to one another, but you didn't have this focal point of, okay, this is where all the money for every place that is not a European place is coming from. And it's all based on debt. And debt you never get out, especially the way that they have it set up with the IMF and the World Bank. And even when we think about now China coming in, when Frank mentioned, if you don't watch after your freedom, if you don't operate within your freedom in the correct way, you're going to have people who are looking to colonize you come in. We know that the Ghana doesn't just owe the IMF, but they have like a $2 billion deals that are in essence debt with China in terms of what they're doing. So they're not even just now in debt to the IMF, but also they've got even more debt from another country that has no interest really in the liberation of Africa. So I think those two things are, important for us to think about when we think about this story.
Yeah, appreciate y'all thoughts, and we can move on to the next story. Quick thought, comment on free trade and all. It is no such thing as free trade in this system. That's an idea, a myth that's been promoted by the colonizers to continue to do what they do: exploit, oppress, and control the market. But we can move on to the next story. And we'll talk more, though. As we do these podcasts, we'll have more conversations around that idea.
So I'll do my story next, since it's also about Ghana, but specifically about Meek Mill going to Ghana. So there was this recently, and I'm going to share my screen real quick to kind of get it up here. So here it is. So recently, we know that for the new year, and this has been happening for the past couple of years, that we've had African people from America going over to the continent to celebrate the new year and things like that. And so there was I forgot what it was called. If you guys remember the name of the concert in Accra, you could just go ahead and say it, but I don't remember what it was called. But like, it was held by I believe Chance the Rapper and one other person, but it was this huge concert that brought over tons of Africans from the diaspora, musicians into Africa around the time of New Year's. And so you have Meek Mill going into Ghana and making a video, like a video within the Jubilee house, which, you know, would they consider like their White House or whatever the case may be. And then people becoming upset over him making this video within all of these different places within, oh, here's the, let me get rid of this ad. I'll just pause. I won't even play it because it's going to play this whole ad. But either way, you kind of see some screenshots here. And so for me, I think, you know, here he's talking about, I mean, here people, it's talking about that he goes, he makes this video within these different places, within the Jubilee Palace. And so people were like upset online at the desecration of the presidency, it says, citing more on security grounds. And it says major influencers on Twitter especially have attracted comments that are largely critical of the government for allowing such sensitive areas to be filmed for a music video. And then, so the reason why I bring this story up, because I think like it's important because there are so many people, so many of us, not so many of us, I guess, but what's happening is that this people going over to the African continent, Black people going over to the African continent, specifically Ghana, is something that is really being put out there. It's really being pushed, not just, you know, through social media and, you know, other Black people who are on social media who are going to Ghana and telling everybody to go over there. But we know obviously Ghana has made it open for us to come over there and inviting for its children to come back home. And so we have people going over there and we have them doing, Afrocello. We have them going over there to do those things. But what are we going over there to do? What is the mindset of those people who are going over there, of us who are going over there? And when we go over there, what are we bringing with us? Because when it reminds me, this whole incident reminds me of the quote from Marcus Garvey that says, "I have no desire to take all Black people back to Africa. There are Blacks who are no good here and will likewise be no good there." Now, whether or not, I'm not really necessarily saying that Meek Mill is just a no good person, but we have to take this into consideration, because when Marcus Garvey is talking about that, he's talking about, because what is it that you're doing? What is it that you're bringing? What is it that you're, how are you thinking about, you know, Black people and African people when you go over there? And through what lens are you doing it from? You know, there's the lack of value, I think, that African people place on their own institutions is shown through this specific incident. Because would they ever allow any celebrity to do that at this, like, let's say in America, at the White House? Would the celebrity even think to do that? Would Meek Mill even think to be like, oh yeah, let me go make a video in different places of the White House? Would he even want to do that? Or would he feel like it's too prestigious or, you know, too sacred to be able to do it but yet go to Africa and say, oh yeah, it's nothing for me to go ahead and make a video within that palace? You know, at what point is something important and sacred, and the value that you place on it is showing everyone else the value that they should place on it? And so this idea that, you know, it's okay to go over into Ghana and go do this and not even think twice about it, right? On the part of Meek Mill and his crew and whoever else he was part of his entourage, but also with even the government allowing that to happen, like where these governments are really up for sale in a sense, where any celebrity, no matter who they are, no matter what they're doing, no matter how much junk they may be pushing here, and no matter how much they don't care about the Black community for real in a real substantive way, or are doing anything for the Black community in a real substantive way that we're talking about in terms of nation building and Pan-Africanism, will just allow them into these spaces and do these things. And then we have then the reaction that you saw. So I think that this story is important because it kind of shows just the lack of the European and colonial influence on the way that we view things, on the institutions, and the way that we see our institutions as having less, as being less than, and devaluing them over institutions that are our own. So that's what, that's one of the things. I don't know if you guys have any thoughts.
Yeah, no, that's that. You go ahead, Frank. That's a fact. Go ahead, Frank.
Yeah. I mean, if I don't think we running out of time, but I urge the viewer to either go maybe on YouTube and tap in Meek Mill video he made in Ghana, and then maybe you can watch it from there, and you'll try to understand or analyze what we are also saying here. But if we had time, I would have said the video should be played, maybe part of A, but we don't have time. But one thing and something that I got from that video is that I think that's what sometimes we have to be very careful on if we are inviting celebrity. I mean, they also do it in the United States here, and we are seeing the same pattern, being repeated on the African continent, where people just pick anybody to give messages. And I think Meek Mill was the wrong person to be picked to carry on that message. Number one is that it wasn't a bad thing or a bad move to ask a musician, right, to launch a video to search a place. Now, I think what Meek Mill should have done was that come out with a video, right? Because I think that was it, if I'm not mistaken, that was his first time going back to, let's say, going to Ghana. So coming out with such video, I think he should have made it in a way where to remember, our forefather, to remember our ancestor, like make a video in a way that showing something that appreciation of the struggle they went through, showing appreciation that you were the one able to go back, showing appreciation that your presence on the African continent, it is them that have returned, showing appreciation that, what, this is the how they call it, the gate of no return. This is the gate of return. I mean, like, try to bring out something like that, but the messages or the rap in which, he went about giving it was just trying to, again, portray, like, let's say in America, this is how we managed to survive in America. So I believe this is the same culture you need to do in Africa here, live the same, way of life here to survive. Like, when you really look at that video, that's the kind of measure of negative connotation is given, or it gave, to African in the diaspora here. And that's how people on the African continent, again, we also believe. That's why you see a lot of criticism, because right there it makes people to believe that, oh, okay, then this is what the news always says about African or in America, or let me be specific about African American in America. See what Meek Mill did here, see what he displays here, and you're going to prove the Western media right for what he just did. Okay, so what the measures that he came out with, or the way he came out with his measure or his approach, to me, it was not right. And I'm seeing the chat here like he apologized, and I hope he apologized, he can still make it back. But I think he's been on the African continent in Ghana. It was not, to me, it was not really particularly about him, but it could be about to acknowledge the suffering and the humiliation of those that died even on the sea, that did not even get the chance to even reach to the so-called promised land, okay? And they did not get a chance again to return back to their home, and they were buried at sea, and they left at sea. And those that came and they did not get the time to go back home, and they left in a so-called developed world or developed land, and they suffer, they labor, and they die. They did not get no recognition. And up to now, the descendants are not even yet being recognized, and they're returning back on the African continent. I think, as a living person, it should be a testimony to those that suffer, to those that bled and died, and those that even fought for freedom to get you at this point, the place you are. I think that could be his message, and it was going to be really nice that, okay, Africa is open to the African diaspora. It is time for to go home. I think it could really be fun and great than the approach he took. And that is why, again, it was wrong. He was a wrong person to be used.
Yeah, I think just real quick on this story. Yeah, Meek Mills, he did apologize that, and I appreciate that too, because he's acknowledging that, hey, I did something that offended people. So it's going to get him to think. I think the whole experience, he's learning right now. The fact that he went over there, when I heard about it, and his statements about Ghana afterwards, in regards to just like feeling, knowing that he went back home, like he acknowledged that. And he was saying, oh, they've been hiding this from us, Africa. Like, I was like, okay, so him being exposed to African culture, African people on the continent, I know it impacted him in a positive way. It still remains to be seen how much of an impact that it had on him. But I think like him just being very excited to be back on the continent also shows like, yeah, Africa is, is not what the media is portraying, what they make it out to be, where we have Africans in the diaspora who came by way of the transatlantic slave trade, have this picture of Africa, and sort of like that's not on the top of the list of places they want to visit. They'll go to the colonizing nation before they go to Africa, right? So I thought that was important. Yeah, one more thing too about this situation. I lost my train of thought, but Frank, you want to go into your story?
Yeah, going to my story. Let me see here. So I'm not going to read the whole thing. I just want to read it, Helen. So it says, Nigeria, Kenya, Zambia, Uganda currencies seems weakening. So I'm going to just read the first part, and then because everything is the same. So it said Nigeria, Naira is seen weakening on the official market after the currency dropped to a record low due to a backlog demand for foreign exchange trade. For foreign exchange, trader said. So I'm going to take this. So everything is the same as it applied to the rest of the nation. Now, so this is again another area that is affecting the African nations. Okay, so as long, so first of all, let me say this, and I think African leaders, again, sometimes they feel that we are so harsh on them. It's not that we are harsh on them, but let them also think about Russia when the US or Great Britain put sanction on Russia, thinking that it was going to affect Russia, trade system. So because they felt that Russia was selling oil and so forth and things, so they put sanction on Russia so that would cripple the selling of the oil in Russia, right? But now knew at the end of the day, it was even going to affect the same United States and the same Europe. So what Russia did was that instead of people buying Russia oil in the pound or in US dollar, Russia said, okay, then I'm going to sell my oil in my currency. Okay, so because Russia was selling her oil in her currency, the sanction did not really significantly affect Russia, but rather it affected the same Europe and the same US, because now you can't use your US dollar to buy oil. You have to use the ruble or the Russian dollar. Now, that is to say, in Africa, as long we use the US currency or European currency to buy goods or to trade, it make us less, develop, or less important, or it make our country, our currency less value, because we don't use our currency or the African currencies, right, to trade. And if you cannot use your currency to trade, the currency you use to trade is the currency that is going to be valued. So again, that is just another colonial system in Africa. That is why we're fighting hard when we say decolonization. These are some of the issue we are facing on the African continent. We do not have currency. That is why we are so weakening. That is why we cannot even trade among ourselves, because if we have currency, who told you that, or who says that we were going to depend on Europe and about how they call it trade and things? If we have one currency in Africa, we were going to use our currency and we're going to trade among ourselves, and we were still going to have the so-called middle class people always usually talk about. But because we depend on foreign currency, that is why the moment they affect the supply chain of the market, it also affects us. The moment they hold back their currency, it also affects us. So the moment we want to hold back our resources, then what are they going to do? They say our currencies and value have dropped. Okay, then right there become a constraint. We can't trade, we can't sell, we can't export. So we have to use their currency. So that's another thing on the African continent. And as long as these nations see themselves as independent nations, this is how we're going to be until they can unite, or until they can have one currency on the entire African continent. It's going to be difficult for us, because for Eastern, there's a crisis in America or in Europe. It's going to affect us down in Africa, and which is not supposed to be so. European crisis, under no circumstances it affect us. American crisis, under no circumstances it should affect us, because our crisis in Africa does not affect you, how they call it, American trader. It does not affect European trader. So why their crisis should always affect us? These are some of the things we keep telling African leaders: unite, have one currency, have one how they call it, central bank. If we are not saying it because we want to do something other different, so we just backing them. Okay, these are the reason why Africa is like that. You guys should unite and try to find one common ground and put things together, please.
Yeah, and I think that the idea of currency and the value of it, we know that the US dollar is not backed by anything. There's nothing holding it up beside the value that people place in it. So like you're saying, Frank, it goes back to this idea of what are our values and what are the things that we value. But also I think having one common currency, because I know like it's similar when we think about language in these African countries, right? They don't want to choose the one language because there's so many different groups of people in different languages within the country, and choose one language to be the national language. And so therefore they're okay with having a European language as the national language. But if you can think about the fact that, okay, you can use it in the short term so that you can create a currency that you can come to common ground with it, so that nobody feels any kind of way, but just under the idea that you need to unify in order to make it stronger. And then maybe eventually later, after these African countries have gotten strong and the currency is strong and the trade, their independence is really secured, you can then maybe transition into having different currencies if you want to, but knowing that you're in a particular space where you need to be able to have strong currency, being okay with having one currency and not feeling like, okay, well, we're gonna leave this group out or whatever, but understanding the idea is to use it for now, to be able to do this now in a way that helps you build to the place that you want to be. And then if you want things to change later, it can, because you put yourself in the position to be able to do that in a way that it's not detrimental to African countries.
Yeah, I agree. I think a huge contradiction that is exposed in this conversation is that Africa has the laborers, right? What, a billion, population of over a billion. They have the resources. Natural resources. They have the people, and so the currency. There's something there for the currency to back. And there's no way in the world that these nations should be poor, or their currency is weak in comparison to these other nations who don't have these resources or anything that they could use to back that currency. And so we don't have enough time to get into the whole value and everything. But if you look at the strongest currencies in the world, you're not going to see any African nation. The European Union has a single currency, and they do that so that they are able to compete with some of the other nations, such as the United States. Yes, competing with the United States, China, and some of these other bigger nations, because Europe as a whole, as single entities, they're small nations. They're small nations, and by themselves, they're not as strong. And so the European Union was created so they can be able to compete with other places economically. This is part of a plan. It's not a future plan. It's not that Europe was saying right now, things is terrible, we need to do this. No, they were saying 20 years from now, 30 years from now, 40 years from now, China is going to be like this. We still have to compete with the United States. Africa is on a rise. So what do we have to do now to make sure that we can maintain our position of power in the world? We have to create a single currency. We have to create a European Union. This was going back to the 1920s, man. Like, but we have to move forward. It's 10:40. Let's do it. So we're gonna go into our Black Power Fund promo. All right. So that's our Black Power Fund. The objective of the Black Power Fund is to support community projects that are addressing the food security needs of African people. Colonialism has stripped the ability and freedom of the masses of Africans to produce for themselves. The Black Power Fund was created to address this contradiction. So we're going to be launching the Black Power Fund next month. So you'll be able to register for that. So you can go to our website, wechargecolonialism.org, and look for the Black Power Fund. Again, you'll be able to apply for the Black Power Fund starting next month. So let's get into our reading. We don't have a lot of time, but we're on chapter 4 of Conscientism. I'm actually going to pull it up on my screen. There's also a link for those people who want to follow along with us. Right. So again, we're on chapter 4 of Conscientism, the philosophy for decolonization. So practice without thought is blind. Thought without practice is empty. The 3 segments of African society, which I specified in the last chapter, the traditional, the Western, and the Islamic, coexist uneasily. The principles animating them are often in conflict with one another. I have in illustration tried to show how the principles which inform capitalism are in conflict with the socialist egalitarianism of the traditional African society. What is to be done then? I have stressed that the 2 other segments, in order to be rightly seen, must be accommodated only as experiences of the traditional African society. If we fail to do this, our society will be racked by the most malignant schizophrenia. Our attitude to the Western and the Islamic experience must be purposeful. It must also be guided by thought, for practice without thought is blind. What is called for as a first step is a body of connection, thought which will determine the general nature of our action in unifying the society which we have inherited. This unification to take account at all times of the elevated ideas underlying the traditional African society. Social revolution must therefore have, standing firmly behind it, an intellectual revolution, a revolution in which our thinking and philosophy are directed towards the redemption of our society. Our philosophy must find its weapons in the environment and living conditions of the African people. It is from those conditions that the intellectual content of our philosophy must be created. The emancipation of the African continent is the emancipation of man. This requires 2 aims. First, the restitution of the egalitarianism of human society, and second, the logistic mobilization of all our resources toward the attainment of that restitution. Do we want to build on that before I move on?
Yeah,
Powerful stuff.
I think let's build on that. And yeah, especially given the time we have. Um I think one of the things that sticks out for me is two things, but I guess I'll speak on one thing. Is the bottom part, where at the bottom of the page, where he says the emancipation of the African continent is the emancipation of man. And so this is something that I often think about, because there's always this push for us to take everybody else's issues on when we're dealing with African people, when we're talking about race first. And so the understanding that, like, focusing on what we have to do, focusing on Africa, focusing on African people will in essence do what everyone wants, wants other people to do, which is, like, help to liberate these other people. But like it says in here, the emancipation of the African continent is the emancipation of man. That with the emancipation of Africa, it will emancipate all those other groups that are non-European, that are under the yoke of European domination and colonialism, so that we don't have to jump on everybody's bandwagon. We don't have to bring everybody's problems into our work that we're doing, because when we free Africa, we will in essence be freeing man. And so when people talk about, we focus, like when they give critiques about focusing too much on, Africa or just Black people, I think this is, this sums it up.
Hey, to build on what you just said, I think, like, when we talk about Pan-Africanism, it has to be understood, like, Pan-Africanism isn't a racist ideology in the sense that Africans are looking at ourselves as superior to other groups of people. Therefore, we need to be dominating these other groups of people and so forth, right? That these people need to be civilized by the African. Like, we don't, Pan-Africanism is about dismantling the system of oppression and exploitation against African people. And it's about unifying Africans in order to do that, so we can create something, a more humane system. And so even that connection of liberating Africa, it's going to liberate all of humankind at the end of the day. And so even in that sentence that you just read, it shows the humanity of Pan-Africanism and the system that we're looking to develop, which is an egalitarian system, as he mentioned. But there's something he said, I think it was the first paragraph. Is it the first paragraph? He talked about, I have in illustration tried to show how the principles which inform capitalism are in conflict with the socialist egalitarianism of the traditional African society. And there may have been some other stuff, but I know when I read this, I just had jotted down some thoughts about capitalism being in conflict with socialist egalitarianism of the traditional African societies. Because, yeah, I mean, you just think about socialism, right? And I don't care. And when we talk about socialism, we ain't talking about no Marxism or no European ideas, right? We're just talking about an egalitarian system, communalism. And this is a system where African people, or people who adopt this system, say we're going to move together. We're going to move forward together. We're going to progress together. Under the system of capitalism, I'm going to progress at the expense of my brothers and sisters, at the expense of the community, and at the expense of the whole human civilized, or all of humanity. That's capitalism. And when just another point is, when the masses of people buy into this system, what we do is we reflect the ideas and behavior of the bourgeoisie. Even as workers, we reflect this, because we have this aspirations of being able to I got to make as much money as I can under this system. Let me invest in this. Let me invest. It's this greed. It's about trying to get as much resources as possible. So you're competing with everyone else. It's a system of competition against each other, which is a system of destruction at the end of the day. But that stood out to me because it made me think of Ubuntu. I'll leave it at this point, and I'll pass it to you, Frank. Because Ubuntu is an example of that. If you know the story about the anthropologists, well, of course, Ubuntu is a philosophy, an African philosophy. But there's a story about this anthropologist who goes to South Africa, and whether it's a true story or not, but just the moral of the story, and he puts this bag of candy at a tree and asks the African children to race for the tree. The first one to get it gets all of the candy. And when they ran, they grabbed each other's hands, went to the candy, and they took the candy and everybody and shared it amongst each other. And the anthropologist looking in awe because he's coming from a society where they're competing for resources and it's me against you. He's looking at them in awe and asks them, why didn't you just go and get it yourself? And they say, how can I be happy if my brothers and sisters aren't happy? And that's socialism. That's Ubuntu. And even if the system moves relatively slowly to the system of capitalism in regards to technological advancements, it doesn't matter. We can't look at it like that. We have to make sure that all of our community is able to have food, clothing, and shelter, right? And so, there's just some initial thoughts. Go ahead, Frank.
Yeah, just to add to that, what Nkrumah was saying as well, that even though when he was comparing the African consciousness like communalism or socialism as that of the Western capitalist system. So, and what I like about his analysis is that he would talk about the Western system and then talk about the African system, and then remind you that look at both systems, and also look back, into the African system and see what worked. Like look back to history and see how we lived before the European came to the African continent. So, and in reality, when you look back to how we lived before Western influence or before Western toxic civilization on the African continent, we did not really believe in competition. So, and I believe this was the kind of time that Nkrumah was looking at, and he was writing this book and trying to remind us that, look, even as we are trying to adapt the so-called Western system, I don't think it's a system that's going to work for us, because as the African and looking at the African continent, we don't believe in competition. And once you start talking about competition, what's going to happen here is that you're going to find yourself in a situation where you won't cooperate with one another, you won't coordinate information with one another, because you find yourself in a race with your brothers and sisters, with another African nations, right? With another borders created by colonialism. So you're going to find yourself in a situation where you are not going to pass on information that would rather elaborate your brothers and sisters on the other side who think they have border with you. So these are the kind of things Nkrumah was talking about. Like, look, listen, go back to your old system and see how you live. Because in Africa, right, the entire African nation, there is no part of Africa that will say, I did not experience colonialism, I did not experience Churchill, I did not experience disadvantage or oppression and things. The entire African continent, right, experience it. So why should we intend again have the same system among us, and then have information with us, and then run competition among us here, compete with one another, when the resources of Africa is within Africa? Okay, so I don't think there's a need that we have competition among ourselves. And that is why socialism or communalism is not about competition as compared to the Western form of government or the Western form of civilization. It involves competition. So that is why, you find more hate. People just wake up in the morning, they are so angry because you have to compete in order to survive. But Nkrumah was telling us, with that kind of system, we don't want to have in Africa where you have to compete before you survive. You don't have to compete. You don't have to compete before you have a meal on the table. You don't have to compete before you can even benefit from your own resources. And that's the kind of system the Europeans have. Okay, with our own resources, we have to compete for it with them. Okay, African people have to compete for their own resources with Europe, with America, before they can even have a taste, before they can survive, before they can even have money to say that they have money in the bank. So these are the things Nkrumah was talking about. Like, look, we have to go back to our system. We don't have to compete for our own resources. We don't have to compete for anything in Africa with ourselves. So these are the things. So and I think reading this book, reading something like this, I think the next generation or the next leader or ship that is to come in Africa, these are some of the steps or solutions that they need to take to bring back Africa and to give back Africa to the rightful people.
Yeah, that's powerful. That's powerful. Yeah, man, everybody needs to hear that. Last thought. I know we have a few minutes. I was looking at that next paragraph. I wanted to get into it, but he goes on to say this will be, you know, if y'all have some last thoughts, he goes into discussing Christianity and Islam, and one of the points that he makes throughout this book is that whatever philosophy you have, it has to be Africanized, and that's very important. What happens is we develop philosophies and it's detached from our experiences as African people. And so he's saying, hey, if you are going to practice these things, you have to at least Africanize it. And he goes into talking about he's a materialist in the next few paragraphs. I encourage folks to continue reading and finishing the book up. But that's the important thing we have to be ever so conscious of, is that it's our experiences as African people and understanding our history, Sankofa, and what we're building on that and what we have to do in today's time and building philosophies and ideologies around our experiences and not having something come from the outside. Because the experiences of Africans 1,000, 2,000, 5,000 years ago is different today, right? And so we're going to have a different language altogether to describe these experiences. And even through science, there's things that have been discovered that our ancestors just weren't aware of, but they were conscious enough to know that there was something going on, right? And we're able to harmonize or develop systems that was congruent with the universe based off of their understanding of the understanding of the environment. But once your understanding deepens, once you deepen that, like, you begin to develop a different language and different perspective, right? And so I say all that to say is, like, today we have to understand our material conditions as African people, develop ideas, develop a language around that. And part of the problem when it comes to colonialism, colonial capitalism, is that we have developed the perspective and the perspective, the behavior, the philosophies and ideas of the very same people that are colonizing us. And so somebody had put revolutionary Pan-Africanism. And that's very important, because when we have people talking about Pan-Africanism, but they're talking about colonial, like adopting the system of colonial capitalism, investing in this system, then that's a problem. That's not the type of Pan-Africanism that we need. I heard one person, last thing, I heard one person say that, yeah, you know, we should, in the diaspora, we should go to Africa. We should, you know, exploit it for the resources. It's better that we do it than a European do it. And I'm like, what? Like, this is the mentality that we have. Like, we're going to go colonize Africa. It's better because we're going to treat them better than Europeans would treat them. That's not Pan-Africanism. That's not the Pan-Africanism that we're promoting. So yeah, but that's last thoughts. I know we're running out of
time. For my last thoughts, I think just going back to that particular place where, you know, where I read before, but going to the next sentence where it says this emancipation of the African continent requires two aims. First, the restitution of the egalitarianism of human society, and second, the logistical mobilization of all of our resources toward the attainment of that restitution. So I think it's key, the logistical mobilization of all of our resources toward this. And so a lot of the times when we're talking about whether or not, I mean, what are the solutions? What should we be doing? That's a call to action right there. That's a solution right there when we're talking about it, right? The mobilization, really thinking and being self-critical as to, okay, if I want to do something, am I mobilizing my resources toward that restitution, toward that attainment? And so if you want to think of a answer to colonialism or a solution to some of our issues, is to mobilize our resources toward the restitution of Africa, of African people, of African communities. If you're not doing that and you're asking for solutions, then you have to look at yourself, right? You have to be self-reflective in that terms. And so that's what we have to be doing. Where we should be using our resources to restore this particular type that Akim brought up, and that Nkrumah brings up, this egalitarian society that we know is possible because we know we did it before.
Yeah, in adding to that, also when I read this aspect of the book where he talked about religion, and so and Nkrumah, what he did in the book, actually he kind of explained, and then asking the reader, look, if you read this book, right, I'm just asking you to look, what do you think about it? So when you read, what I got from there is that he was telling us, like, look, I'm not telling you, right, you are already a Muslim, you are already being indoctrinated. I'm not telling you to leave it. I'm not telling you to stop being a Christian. You already been indoctrinated, right? But what I'm telling you here is, look at how you live before, how they call it, or the religion Muslim, or before the religion Christianity. How did you live? How did you communicate? How did you relate information to other kingdoms, to other nations within the African continent? How did you live? So were there peace as compared to where you have religion, like you have Christianity or you have Muslim with how they call it on the African continent? So he was just trying to tell, like, look in between. Were there peace at that time? Were there more harmony at that time? Because one of the things we face these days, even on the African continent, right? We have taken people religion solely to be we even practice the religion more than the people who brought the religion to us. Like African on the continent practice Muslim, how they call it, the Muslim religion than the people in the Middle East. People on the African continent practice the Christianity religion than the people who came from Rome, or who came from, how they call it, the Roman Empire, or so forth and things, or even the Catholic. They practice it more than the people themselves. So Nkrumah was trying to tell us that, look in between the line right here. Is it very beneficial? Like, is the practice of Muslim benefiting the African nations? Is the practice of Christianity actually benefiting African people? Because it have caused more division. The African Muslim does not want to see African Christian. African Christian does not want to see African Muslim. In fact, we have taken Western interpretation of the Muslim, right? So African people, even African Christianity, even hate his or her own brother on the African continent who are Muslim. We see them as terrorists. We see them as killers, because that's how the West have gave the interpretation of Muslim, right? So our own brothers and sisters who practice the religion that does not belong to them, we see them as threat. Now, and then the opposite again, even Muslim on the African continent also see people who practice Christianity as threat. So it have caused huge confusion, division, to the extent that in Africa, right, some nation, Muslim, you can't be president. They will tell you, no, you are Muslim, you are not a Christian. We are not going to elect a Muslim person as president. And then some nation too, you will see most who practice Muslim will say they are not going to elect how they call it, a Christian person as leader, as president. So all of these things, Nkrumah was just telling us, look at what it have done to us. Look at what it is doing to us. Why can't we look back to our old system and see what we can pick up from there, and see, how we can move forward, how we can progress our nation or our continent?
Hey, that's peace. That's peace. Sankofa needs to be a class That's
Yeah.
what we need everywhere. Sankofa. That should be.
What Frank was saying is basically they brought the Crusades into Africa.
Mhm.
That's a fact. I mean, historically correct. That's historically correct. Well, appreciate everybody for tuning in. Let me clear my throat. All right. Appreciate everybody for tuning in to another episode. We Charge Colonialism Podcast and Book Club. We will be back at 10 a.m. next week. Today at 11:30 a.m. for all those people who want to come back on, get some more information. I'm going to be interviewing Abundance and Ujamaa. Last time they were with us, we were discussing Kwanzaa. Today at 11:30, we'll be discussing the latest ebook put out by Abundance and Ujamaa, the Abundance and Ujamaa movement, called Living in Abundance. So join us at 11:30 Eastern Time for that discussion, which isn't too long from now. So hope you guys tune in. So until next time, peace.